Right now, across the Western world, like 80% of all loans are being used for one single terrifying purpose.
Wow.
And that is simply to roll over old debt.
Yeah, it's a completely staggering statistic, really.
I mean, imagine taking out a brand new mortgage just to cover the interest payment on your last one, right? And doing that every single month.
Exactly. It's an endless treadmill.
According to Michael Howell of Cross Border Capital, that is the exact treadmill our entire civilization is running on today. And it leaves um, a measly 20% of capital for actual innovation.
Right, for building infrastructure or,
Yeah.
actually moving society forward.
Yeah.
And that statistic, it highlights this fundamental structural decay that I think most people only feel as like a vague sense of unease.
Oh, for sure. We see the symptoms everywhere, right?
We do. I mean, we complain about inflation at the grocery store, the extreme polarization in our politics, the fact that a local bridge has been under construction for 5 years.
Tell me about it.
But rather than analyzing those symptoms in isolation, we really need to look at the very foundation of how value is created and stored.
And that is exactly our mission for today. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into a fascinating, sweeping, and honestly quite controversial theory that attempts to map the root cause of all this societal murkiness.
Yeah, the big one.
It is. We are drawing from an incredibly detailed recent interview with the Dutch financial expert Sander Boon. This was featured on the Holland Gold channel. And we're going to explore what the source calls the money bubble and the thought bubble.
Which are deeply intertwined concepts.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be tracing the hidden connections between, the money sitting in your wallet, the political decisions dominating your newsfeed, and the very way our institutions view human nature.
It connects a lot of dots that people usually keep separate.
It really does. Okay, let's unpack this. But before we dive into the deep end, I need to put a very clear disclaimer on the table for you listening.
Definitely necessary for this one.
Yeah. This source material contains some strongly held politically charged viewpoints. I mean, we are going to be touching on everything from COVID policies and climate change to globalization and social engineering.
A lot of third wheel topics.
Exactly. So,
Hi.
as your guides, our goal is absolutely not to take sides or endorse these viewpoints. We are just here to impartially map out these arguments, right? To rigorously examine the logic the source is using.
Right, to lay out the mechanics so that you can understand the original material and, frankly, make up your own mind.
Precisely. So, where do we even begin with this?
Well, the value of this exercise lies in dissecting the anatomy of the argument itself, right? So to understand how we arrived at this 80% debt rollover precipice, the source argues we have to rewind the clock
How far back?
to 1973.
Okay, 1973.
Yeah, that year marks the definitive end of the traditional monetary system. It's the global shift from what is termed hard money to soft money. And understanding the mechanical difference between those two systems is, it's the key to unlocking the rest of this entire theory.
So let's establish that baseline, because I think most of us vaguely understand that money used to be backed by gold, but we rarely think about what that actually meant for the gears of the economy.
We don't, because we don't live in it anymore.
Right. So the source talks about the classic gold standard from roughly 1871 to 1914 as the ultimate hard money era.
Yeah, and if we look at the mechanics of that era, a hard money system is one fundamentally bound by physical reality.
Oh.
The money itself, or the claim on the money, has intrinsic scarcity. It cannot just be, willed into existence by a politician facing a tough re-election.
Or by a central bank decree.
Exactly. And some proponents today even suggest that Bitcoin might eventually serve a similar functional role.
Oh, interesting.
But the crucial operating mechanism of hard money, which the source emphasizes heavily, is this concept of settlement.
Yeah, I want to make sure we don't gloss over that word settlement because it sounds, like boring banking jargon.
It really does.
Walk us through how settlement actually functioned back then, step by step. Let's say country A decides they want to live large. They start buying massive amounts of goods, importing wine and steel and textiles from country B, far more than they are exporting. What happens?
Well, the mechanism operates like an automatic braking system. Under a strict gold standard, when country A runs that massive trade deficit, they can't just send digital IOUs.
Right, they can't just hit a button.
No, they literally have to load physical gold onto ships and send it across the ocean to country B to settle the imbalance.
Oh, literal ships of gold.
Literal ships. And when that gold physically leaves country A, their central bank suddenly possesses fewer reserves in the vault.
And since their domestic paper currency is legally tied to the amount of gold in that vault, They have to act.
Yes, they are mechanically forced to shrink their domestic credit system.
Because they literally don't have the bedrock to support the paper anymore.
Precisely the underlying logic. The central bank must raise interest rates. Money becomes scarce, and it becomes very expensive to borrow.
So the domestic economy just slows down.
It has to. Businesses pull back, citizens consume less. It is a painful, immediate, and mathematically unavoidable consequence for overconsumption.
I mean, a politician can't just give a speech to stop the gold from leaving the vault.
They can't. The system naturally and ruthlessly corrects itself. And the source argues that this enforced a culture of economic virtue, self-discipline, and long-term planning.
It sounds like using a physical debit card, honestly.
That's a great way to think about it.
Like if you go on a shopping spree and empty your checking account, your card gets declined at the register. It's embarrassing, it's painful, but it's a brilliant wake-up call that you are out of cash and you need to change your behavior immediately.
Right.
But then, as you mentioned, we hit 1973. The world fully abandons that physical settlement. We move to soft money. And if hard money is a debit card, soft money feels like a credit card with a literally infinite limit.
Building on that analogy, when the limit is infinite, the behavioral feedback loop is entirely severed.
Yeah.
Soft money is the fiat currency system we live under right now. It's characterized by flexible exchange rates, where the currency is completely unbacked by any physical commodity.
Its value rests purely on government decree.
Government decree, and the continuous creation of debt. And the source brings in a fascinating historical figure here to illustrate the psychology of this shift.
Who's that?
Jacques Rueff. He was an influential economic advisor to French President Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s.
Right, and Rueff coined a specific phrase that the source uses as the cornerstone for this entire theory.
He called it deficits without tears.
Deficits without tears. Man, that paints quite a picture.
What's fascinating here is the psychological shift Rueff identified. In a soft money system, if a dominant nation wants to buy endless goods from overseas, or fund a sprawling domestic welfare state, or finance a foreign war.
They no longer lose physical gold.
Exactly. They simply issue more debt. They instruct the central bank to print treasury bonds. The physical geographic restraint of that gold ship sailing away is just gone.
So if I'm a policymaker, my incentive structure completely inverts. I don't have to make the hard choice between raising taxes, which gets me voted out of office, or cutting popular programs, which also gets me voted out.
Right. You avoid the hard choices entirely.
I can just paper over the gap.
The feedback loop of reality is broken. Without the threat of an immediate, sharp economic contraction, governments are incentivized to build what the source describes as a massive pyramid of debt.
Wow, a pyramid of debt.
Yeah, the pain, the tears of the deficit, they aren't eliminated, but they are deferred. Instead of a sharp corrective recession, society experiences a slow, grinding, systemic devaluation of the currency itself.
So it's just slow motion pain. And I'm looking at this date, the source pinpoints for when this debt pyramid really went into overdrive.
1988.
Yeah, 1988. Specifically, a rule change by the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. Now, on paper, adjusting bank capital requirements sounds like the most boring regulatory footnote imaginable.
It sounds incredibly dry.
Right. Why is the source treating a 1988 BIS rule like the match that lit the powder keg?
Because the mechanism behind that rule change fundamentally rewired the global banking system.
Okay, how so?
Well, the BIS is essentially the central bank for all central banks. In 1988, they instituted the Basel I Accords. This dictated how much capital a commercial bank had to hold in reserve against the loans they made.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, if a local bank wanted to lend money to a local entrepreneur to start a bakery, the regulators assigned that a high-risk weighting. That meant the bank had to hold a significant amount of capital in reserve.
Because it's risky.
Right. Mortgages had a slightly lower risk weighting.
Which also makes sense. I mean, a startup bakery might fail. A house is at least physical collateral.
Exactly. But here's the critical pivot. The VIS assigned a risk weighting of 0% to sovereign government debt.
Wait, 0%?
0%. They gave government bonds an official risk-free stamp.
Wait, let me put myself in the shoes of a bank manager in 1989 then. I have a pool of depositors' money. I can either lend it to that local bakery, take on risk and tie up my capital reserves, or I can take that exact same money, buy government treasury bonds, face zero capital requirements, and collect a guaranteed yield.
The mathematical choice for the banking sector became absolute. It was a no-brainer.
Yeah.
This obscure regulatory tweak supercharged the expansion of the state. It birthed this deeply symbiotic relationship between governments and the financial sector.
I can see that.
The banks are incentivized to fund the government's infinite credit card endlessly. And in return, when the banks inevitably take on too much leverage and get into trouble, like we saw in 2008,
The government bails them out.
yes, via the central bank, the profits from this arrangement are entirely privatized, but the massive systemic risks are socialized onto the taxpayer.
It's a closed loop. And this brings us to a phenomenon the source leans on to explain the societal fallout of this infinite credit card, which is the Cantillon effect.
Yes, a very important concept.
We hear about wealth inequality constantly, but the Cantillon effect actually explains the mechanical plumbing of how the money moves to create that inequality. Break that down for you listening.
Sure, so Richard Cantillon was an 18th century economist who observed that when new money is created, it does not magically appear in everyone's bank account simultaneously or evenly.
Right.
It enters the economy at a very specific point. And in our modern system, that point of entry is the banking sector and the financial markets.
It basically gets poured onto the very top of the pyramid.
Exactly. The entities closest to the money printer. So large commercial banks, hedge funds, massive corporations, and the ultra-wealthy, they receive this new liquidity first.
Okay.
And they are able to use this fresh money to buy up hard assets. Prime real estate, stocks, corporate buyout.
Before the inflation hits.
Crucially, yes. They make these purchases before the new money is circulated enough to cause prices in the broader economy to rise.
Okay, let me ground this in a real-world scenario so we can really picture it. Let's say the central bank prints $1 trillion to stimulate the economy. Wall Street gets access to that cheap credit on day one, right?
Right.
They use it to buy up single-family homes across the country. 18 months later, that $1 trillion has trickled its way through the plumbing. The money supply is vastly larger, which means each individual dollar is worth less.
Correct.
So for the listener who is just trying to buy groceries, the price of a carton of eggs has spiked. Their wages haven't moved, but their purchasing power has plummeted.
Yes.
Meanwhile, the Wall Street firm that bought the houses saw their asset value skyrocket because of the inflation.
That is the exact mechanism. The source views this dynamic as an invisible regressive tax.
It totally is.
Under a soft money system, extreme wealth accumulation at the top isn't necessarily the result of brilliant innovation or free market capitalism. It is often a policy artifact. It is the mathematical result of proximity to the fiat money spigot.
Proximity to the spigot. And when the average citizen realizes that holding onto their cash is a losing game, we see Gresham's law kick in. Bad money drives out good money.
Yeah. Observing human behavior, when people know their fiat currency is structurally designed to lose purchasing power, they treat it like a hot potato.
Get rid of it.
They spend it as fast as possible. They often take on personal debt to do so because paying back a loan with devalued future dollars is mathematically advantageous.
That's wild.
But conversely, if they manage to acquire good money, assets with intrinsic scarcity like physical gold, or as the source frequently notes, Bitcoin, they pull it out of circulation. They hoard it.
So they spend the bad, hoard the good.
Yes, and the source suggests we are witnessing a slow-motion run on fiat currencies globally as individuals instinctively seek shelter from the systemic devaluation.
Okay, so we have established a very solid baseline here. We've moved from a system of physical restraint, the gold ship sailing away, to a system of infinite credit where governments and banks form a symbiotic loop. And the consequences of bad behavior are just rolled over into the future.
Exactly.
But if the math is this broken on a domestic level, it forces us to ask, how did the global economy actually spend this infinite credit card over the last 30 years?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because that brings us to the source's intense critique of globalization. I mean, for decades, the consensus among almost all mainstream economists was that flexible exchange rates and free capital flows were the ultimate engines of global wealth.
That was the absolute gospel.
The narrative was that capital would magically flow to where it was most efficient, lifting the entire planet out of poverty.
While that narrative was dominant, the source argues that without the physical settlement mechanism to act as a global referee, this open system became highly susceptible to massive manipulation.
And they point to China, right?
Yes. The prime historical example they analyze is China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001.
Right, because from the perspective of the Western consumer, China joining the WTO just meant an explosion of incredibly cheap goods. We got cheap flat-screen TVs, cheap clothes, endless plastic products.
Right, it felt like a boom.
But the source argues there was a hidden plumbing mechanism driving this that actually hollowed out the West. Explain how China manipulated their currency step by step.
Okay, so to maintain their export dominance, the People's Bank of China actively intervened to keep the yuan artificially weak against the US dollar.
Okay.
If a Chinese manufacturer sold $1 million worth of electronics to the US, they received US dollars. But that manufacturer needs yuan to pay their local workers and suppliers, right?
Naturally.
When they exchange those dollars for yuan in a local Chinese bank, the natural market force should dictate that the yuan strengthens in value due to the high demand.
Right, and if the yuan strengthens, their electronics become more expensive for Americans to buy, and the trade boom naturally slows down, the automatic braking system we talked about earlier.
Exactly the mechanism that should have happened. But to bypass that brake, the Chinese central bank stepped in.
What did they do?
They printed massive amounts of yuan to buy up all those incoming US dollars, forcibly keeping their own currency cheap.
But then they are sitting on a mountain of US dollars. What do they do with them?
This is the linchpin of the global imbalance.
Mm.
Instead of using those dollars to buy American-made goods, which would balance the trade, they took those hundreds of billions of dollars and bought U.S. Treasury bonds.
Wait.
They loaned the money right back to the United States government.
They literally funded our infinite credit card so we could keep buying their manufactured goods.
That's exactly it. The result was a historic structural distortion. This mechanism artificially subsidized Chinese manufacturing, allowing them to construct an unprecedented industrial base.
While hollowing ours out.
Simultaneously, it allowed the West, particularly the United States, to hyper-financialize. We could run massive government deficits, fight expensive wars, and fuel a domestic credit bubble without facing the immediate inflationary consequences, all because China was absorbing the debt.
It created this bizarre geopolitical mirror image. You look at China today, massive, unparalleled physical production capacity, but relatively low domestic purchasing power for their average citizen.
Yes.
Then you look at the West, massive purchasing power fueled almost entirely by debt and credit bubbles, but places like the American Rust Belt have been completely deindustrialized. We lost the capacity to actually make physical things.
The West became experts at moving money around, creating complex derivatives and servicing debt, while outsourcing the physical reality of production.
Wow.
And this brings up a dire warning cited by the source from Scott Bessent, the current U.S. Treasury Secretary.
Yes, the source mentions Bessent warning that continuing on this path of endless debt accumulation, specifically pointing to the trajectory leading up through the Biden administration, is setting the stage for a massive debt crisis.
A crisis that would dwarf the 2008 financial crash.
Because the absolute scale of the sovereign debt is exponentially larger.
When a sovereign debt bubble of this magnitude reaches its mathematical limit, the pressure has to release. The source points out that central banks will virtually never allow a nominal default.
Because that would mean outright not paying people back?
Right, meaning they won't simply refuse to pay the bondholders, because that would instantly collapse the global banking system. Therefore, the ultimate unavoidable escape valve for this immense pressure is the aggressive devaluation of the currency itself.
So they just print the difference.
They will print whatever quantity of money is required to service the debt, thereby destroying the purchasing power of the money in your wallet.
Wait, I need to jump in here and play the skeptic for a second.
Go for it.
If all the major global currencies, the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, the British pound, if they all soft fiat money and all these central banks are playing the exact same game of debt and devaluation, does it really matter if they all devalue simultaneously?
That's a fair question.
Isn't it just a coordinated race to the bottom where relative exchange rates stay somewhat stable?
What's fascinating here is that this raises an important question about the hierarchy of fiat money. The source addresses this through the concept of the cleanest dirty shirt.
Cleanest dirty shirt.
Yeah. While all fiat currencies share the same structural flaw, they do not hold equal geopolitical weight. The U.S. dollar plays an exceptionally complicated role as the global reserve currency.
It's everywhere.
It is the primary medium of exchange for international trade. Oil and critical commodities are priced and settled in dollars globally.
So it's not just America's domestic currency, it's the plumbing for the entire planet.
Connecting this to the bigger picture, the dollar belongs to the global system. When international markets experience severe stress or panic, global capital instinctively flees to the deepest, most liquid, and perceived safest market available.
Which is the U.S.
Historically, that is the U.S. Treasury market. So, paradoxically, even if the United States is running massive deficits and printing money, the dollar often strengthens against the euro or the yen during a crisis simply because it is the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry basket.
That is such a weird paradox.
It is, and this unique status allows the U.S. to export its inflation to the rest of the world, making the global imbalances incredibly sticky and difficult to unwind without causing a worldwide systemic shock.
Okay, so if the math is this broken and the geopolitical imbalance is this obvious, it forces us to ask a glaring question. What were the architects of the system actually looking at? I mean, if this system has been building toward a crisis worse than 2008 for decades, why didn't the smartest people in the room, the Ivy League economists, the central bankers, the policy advisors, see the rot in the foundation? Why were they cheering on globalization without seeing the underbelly?
This is where the source makes a fascinating pivot, bridging the concept of the money bubble directly into the thought bubble.
The thought bubble. Okay.
The source argues that Western academia and our primary institutions suffer from a profound systemic case of paradigm dominance.
Paradigm dominance. Meaning, once a specific idea wins the academic war, it locks the doors and kicks all competing ideas out of the building.
The mechanics of academia literally enforce this. Once the system, in this specific case, the framework of soft money and the continuously expanding debt finance welfare state, becomes the established norm, entire university faculties adapt to service that norm.
Because of the funding.
Yes. The grant money, the tenure tracks, the prestigious journal publications, all align behind the dominant paradigm. Over a generation, they simply stop teaching or researching anything outside of those boundaries.
It becomes an echo chamber.
The Overton window of acceptable academic inquiry shrinks drastically.
The source breaks this down across several specific academic disciplines, which I find fascinating. Let's start with economics, since we were just talking about central banks. How does paradigm dominance literally function in a modern economics department?
The most glaring critique here is that mainstream macroeconomic models, the ones actively used by central banks to steer the economy, treat money as a neutral entity.
Wait, what?
In many of their sophisticated models, the actual supply of money, the physical expansion of the currency base, is barely factored in as an independent causal variable.
Which sounds completely insane to a layperson. How do you model an economy without looking at the money supply?
Because the dominant paradigm operates on the assumption that money is merely a veil draped over real economic activity.
Yeah.
A lubricant, not a driver.
That's why.
They spend years teaching students the intricate mathematics of managing a fiat system, how adjusting the federal funds rate by 0.25% might marginally impact employment figures. But they completely ignore the historical, foundational debates.
Like what?
The source points out that universities largely no longer teach the historical clash between a currency school and the banking school, or the mechanics of commodity money. They are intensely studying the management of the bubble, but they lack the vocabulary to study the nature of the bubble itself.
It's like a generation of brilliant scientists dedicating their lives to studying ocean currents. They write incredibly complex algorithms modeling the temperature, the speed, and the direction of the waves, but they are operating under an academic consensus that actively pretends the water itself doesn't exist.
That analogy perfectly captures the source's critique.
They refuse to look at the medium they are swimming in.
The medium itself, fiat money, shapes all human economic behavior, but the economists assume the behavior is independent of the medium. And this institutional blindness is not limited to economics. The source extends this critique heavily into political science and law.
Right. The source talks about a historical shift in legal academia from focusing on classical rights to obsessing over social rights. Unpack that distinction for us because it directly ties back to the infinite credit card.
Classical rights are what political philosophers traditionally refer to as negative rights. These include the right to freedom of speech, the right to property, the right to religious freedom, the right to be left alone.
Okay.
Crucially, these rights require the state to refrain from acting against the individual.
So they are cheap to enforce. The government just has to agree not to arrest you for writing a newspaper article. It doesn't cost the taxpayer anything.
Precisely the opposite is true of social rights, which are positive rights. The right to affordable housing, the right to free higher education, the right to universal health care, the right to a minimum standard of living provided by the state.
Oh, I see.
These rights require the state to actively seize resources and provide complex, ongoing services.
Which are incredibly astronomically expensive.
And that is the hidden connection the source is drawing. You can only sustain a sprawling academic, legal, and bureaucratic framework dedicated to maximizing social rights if you have a soft money system capable of endlessly funding them.
Right.
The infinite credit card is the invisible engine powering the expansion of state responsibilities. The law schools teach generations of lawyers and policymakers how to manage, expand, and litigate these social rights, completely blind to the fact that the entire legal structure rests on an unsustainable, inflationary financial foundation.
And the source takes this argument one step further, driving right to the heart of sociology and psychology. This is where they argue the thought bubble completely ignores fundamental human biology.
Yes, the source points to the absolute dominance of the tabula rasa, or blank slate theory, within the social
Or a
sciences.
blank slate.
This is the prevailing idea that human beings possess almost no innate nature, that our behaviors, our disparities, and our outcomes are entirely the product of our environment, our culture, and our socialization.
The classic nature versus nurture debate and academia essentially declared that nurture won in a landslide and nature just doesn't exist.
The appeal of this theory for a bureaucratic state is immense. If humans are truly blank slates, then social engineers are empowered to believe they can mold the perfect citizen and engineer a flawless society simply by applying the right government policies, the right educational interventions, and the right subsidies.
Just tweak the inputs and get the perfect output.
Exactly. But the source argues that this paradigm willfully ignores evolutionary biology, innate behavioral tendencies, and the inherent tragic limitations of human rationality.
So if we synthesize this, the economists are ignoring the money, the legal scholars are ignoring the actual cost of the rights they champion, and the sociologists are actively ignoring human biology. It really is a comprehensive, hermetically sealed bubble.
It is a totalizing worldview.
And to illustrate how incredibly powerful this institutional blind spot is, the source brings up a highly specific, famous example, Paul Krugman.
Paul Krugman serves as the perfect avatar for this phenomenon. He is a Nobel laureate, a highly influential Keynesian economist, and a prominent columnist.
Very promising.
For decades, Krugman was one of the loudest, most authoritative champions of unfettered globalization. When figures like Donald Trump proposed tariff walls to protect domestic industry, Krugman aggressively attacked the policies, representing the absolute consensus of the dominant academic paradigm.
But the source notes a very recent, very quiet shift in his stance.
The source points to a recent interview where Krugman essentially admitted that he, along with the broader economic establishment, suffered from a massive blind spot regarding the negative consequences of globalization. He conceded that they simply did not see or chose to dismiss the severe hollowing out of working-class communities, the massive structural imbalances, and the localized destruction of wealth that occurred under the surface of the aggregate GDP growth.
It's a stunning admission when you really think about it. It's the chief architect of the thought bubble looking out the window and realizing that the actual physical landscape of the country doesn't match the pristine mathematical map they've been drawing on chalkboards for 30 years.
It perfectly illustrates the ultimate danger of paradigm dominance. When an institution excludes dissenting voices, when it labels anyone pointing out the flaws in globalization or fiat money as a crank, a populist, or a whoppie, as the Dutch source notes,
Sloppy, right?
that institution eventually runs headfirst into the brick wall of reality.
Okay, let's follow that thought, because when academia operates inside this impenetrable thought bubble, and it is endlessly, unconditionally funded by the money bubble, it doesn't just stay in the faculty lounge. It bleeds directly into the real world.
It becomes policy.
It becomes national policy. It dictates the daily life and the freedom of you, the listener. Now, a quick but vital reminder. The cultural critiques we are about to explore are drawn directly from the source material.
Yes, important context.
We are mapping out the exact logic the source uses to connect macroeconomic theory to modern social and cultural issues. Our job is to test the structural integrity of the argument, not to endorse the politics.
Exactly. The central concept the source introduces to bridge economics and culture is the idea of the makeable society.
The makeable society. It sounds like social engineering fueled by limitless debt.
That is the exact combination. When you fuse the tabula rasa sociological mindset, the belief that human nature and reality can be infinitely molded with the endless government funding provided by soft money, you generate the grand illusion that society is infinitely makeable.
Because there is no immediate financial consequence for failure. Think about a mom and pop bakery again. If they bake terrible bread, they go bankrupt in a month. Hard reality. But the makeable society operates like a massive startup, backed by an endless supply of venture capital. If a sprawling social program doesn't achieve its stated goals, the state doesn't go bankrupt. They just issue more bonds, expand a budget, and hire more administrators to fix the problem they created.
The source argues that this dynamic births a massive, self-sustaining ecosystem of state bureaucracy and heavily subsidized NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Handing out newly invented rights and continuously managing the frictions of this makeable society becomes a literal business model.
So it's an industry in itself.
The public sector and the subsidized private sector fuse together through lobbying networks, creating an entire administrative class whose very livelihood depends on the continuation of the soft money expansion.
Now, this is where I want to push back and act as the skeptical listener, because the source applies this makeability critique to some very prominent, highly sensitive modern issues. They bring up climate policies, specifically pointing to offshore wind farms.
Yes, they do.
How exactly does the source justify drawing a straight line between central banking policies and green energy initiatives? That feels like a massive leap.
Well, the source bridges that gap by looking at capital allocation. They cite reports indicating that many offshore wind parks are entirely economically unviable on their own. They cannot function or attract private investment without structural, massive, ongoing subsidies from the government.
Okay.
The source's argument is that in a hard money system, where capital is scarce, interest rates are real, and investments must yield an actual return based on physical efficiency, these projects would be severely disciplined by the market. They wouldn't get built.
The math wouldn't work.
But in a soft money system, the state can push forward with a makeable climate agenda, overriding natural economic and thermodynamic limitations simply because they have the power to print the financial difference.
Okay, I understand the economic logic there, even if it's controversial. But the source takes this argument even further, crossing over from infrastructure into human identity. The source explicitly mentions transgender issues as a manifestation of this exact same macroeconomic mindset.
Yes.
Again, playing the skeptic. How on earth does abandoning the gold standard in 1973 lead to modern debates over gender identity?
The source makes a profound philosophical linkage here rather than a strictly financial one. From their perspective, the idea that an individual can override or change their biological reality based entirely on a self-declared internal idea is the ultimate extreme extension of the tabula rasa paradigm.
The blank slate.
Right. The argument is that when a society completely detaches its foundational system of value, its money, from physical reality, a slow cultural rot sets in, where the society eventually attempts to detach from physical reality across all domains.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is the belief that reality, whether it's the laws of economics, the climate, or foundational human biology itself, is entirely makeable and can be shaped purely by sheer human will, language, or policy, completely unmoored from natural constraints.
So, mapping the argument carefully, the source is saying that a society that normalizes deficits without tears in its economy will eventually expect reality without constraints in its culture.
That is the core psychological thesis of the source's argument. When terrible decisions by leadership are no longer punished financially, the entire society undergoes a slow, structural shift in its values. It loses its grounding in the physical world.
How does that actually manifest in the everyday behavior of the public, though?
The source argues that it manifests as a systemic loss of virtue, a decay in self-discipline, and the complete evaporation of long-term vision. We mutate into a fundamentally short-sighted, hyper-consumptive culture.
Just living for today.
Exactly. The logic is simple. Why practice the virtue of saving for the future when the central bank is actively inflating away the purchasing power of your savings?
Makes no sense to save.
Why undertake the difficult, unglamorous work of maintaining existing structures when the government can always print fresh money for flashy, politically popular new projects?
The source uses a really interesting philosophical framework to describe this prevailing cultural mood, referencing the contemporary German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk.
Yes, the distinction Sloterdijk makes, which the source relies on, is between warm thinking and cold thinking. The source argues that modern Western institutions are completely drowning in an era of toxic warm thinking.
Warm thinking, it sounds cozy, but I'm guessing it's not a compliment.
No, warm thinking is the prioritization of consensus, comfort, and ideological cohesion above empirical reality. Everyone in the institutional bubble wants to be agreeable. They want to feel good about the collective moral direction of the makeable society.
Right.
And crucially, anyone who dissents, Anyone who points out the mathematical or physical flaws in the foundation must be immediately marginalized. They are not debated. They are labeled a troublemaker, a dangerous populist, or a threat to democracy.
The source literally compares this culture of warm consensus to a massive club of lemmings, happily jogging off a cliff together, feeling a deep sense of camaraderie because they all agree on the direction they are running.
It's a stark image. And what society desperately lacks, according to the source, is a resurgence of cold thinking.
What's that look like?
Cold thinking is highly rational, strictly empirical, and almost always deeply unpopular in the moment. It is the necessary, abrasive act of standing up in the middle of a meeting and ringing the alarm bell, pointing out that the math simply does not add up, regardless of how pure or noble the intentions behind the policy might be.
And where do we see the actual physical consequences of a society avoiding cold thinking? The source gives some very tangible, concrete examples from the Netherlands where this interview originates.
The source points directly to the physical decay of the public realm. They highlight failing national infrastructure, bridges that are literally collapsing or deemed too dangerous to use. Yes. They specifically zero in on the massive, critical pumping stations in IJmuiden. For a nation situated largely below sea level, these pumps are existential infrastructure.
Literally keeping the water out.
Yet they are reaching the end of their operational life cycle without adequate replacements ready.
Why does a highly developed, incredibly wealthy country let its most vital infrastructure crumble?
The source argues this is the direct result of the makeable society prioritizing warm political narratives over cold maintenance. The regional water boards and politicians focus their budgets on expanding heavily subsidized nature areas or implementing progressive climate initiatives because that generates positive media coverage and fits the dominant paradigm.
It looks good in the press.
Meanwhile, the unglamorous, cold, hard work of pouring concrete, raising the dikes, and replacing industrial pumps is neglected. It's a catastrophic failure of long-term vision, caused entirely by the insulation of the thought bubble.
But if these failures are so blatantly obvious, if the literal bridges are falling down and the inflation is eating people's paychecks, why isn't the mainstream media demanding answers? Why aren't journalists acting as cold thinkers? This brings up the source's heavy critique of censorship and media homogenization.
Yes. The source makes a striking, specific claim about the Dutch media landscape, stating that essentially just two wealthy Belgian families own nearly all the major news outlets, and that these outlets are deeply embedded in a system of government subsidies.
Ah, so they're subsidized too.
The argument is that this highly concentrated ownership and financial reliance on the state leads to profound structural self-censorship. The media ceases to function as a watchdog and instead acts as an amplifier and enforcer for the established paradigm.
They just toe the line.
They all run variations of the exact same stories with the exact approved tone, actively ignoring data that contradicts the makeable society narrative.
And interestingly, in a landscape where many European politicians are calling for tighter regulation of social media, the source heavily praises Elon Musk and his platform X.
Yet despite the intense, coordinated pushback from the political elite, who frequently label the platform a vector for misinformation, the source views X as one of the very last remaining avenues for true, decentralized investigative journalism.
They really trust it.
They see it as a vital public square where cold thinkers can still share raw data, leak documents, and challenge the consensus, completely bypassing the subsidized, homogenized mainstream media gatekeepers.
And the ultimate example the source gives of this media blindness and the absolute refusal of institutions to engage in cold self-reflection is the recent COVID parliamentary inquiry in the Netherlands.
Yes. The source uses a brutal phrase to describe the inquiry. They call it Act 2 theater.
Act 2 theater, meaning it's a scripted performance devoid of any actual consequence.
Precisely. The source argues that leading politicians, such as the former Dutch health minister Hugo de Jonge, demonstrated a chilling lack of self-reflection during these hearings. They simply repeated the mantra that they made the right choices with the information they had at the time, remaining entirely insulated from and unrepentant about the massive societal, psychological, and economic damage their lockdown policies inflicted.
And the source draws a sharp contrast between this European theater and what is actively unfolding in the United States.
Right. They point out that in the U.S., explosive information is being forced into the public domain through Freedom of Information Act requests.
FOIA requests.
Emails and early correspondence from top virologists, specifically naming figures like Marion Koopmans, have been released, revealing internal doubts and maneuvers that fundamentally challenge the official monolithic narrative of the pandemic's early days.
Stuff that was totally hidden.
Yet, according to the source, the European mainstream media largely ignores these massive revelations, opting instead to maintain the protective, comfortable seal of the thought bubble rather than engage in cold, difficult journalism.
Okay, let's take a breath, because we have painted a remarkably stark, heavy picture of the world. We are looking at an unsustainable 80% rollover debt bubble, an academic and political class firmly trapped in a subsidized thought bubble, a culture addicted to short-term warm thinking, and failing physical infrastructure.
Is a lot to take in.
It really is. Which brings us to the most pressing question and the final major theme of our deep dive: AI, future shocks, and the European dilemma. With all these massive, seemingly unstoppable imbalances locked into place, where do we go from here? What is the catalyst that finally breaks the paradigm?
Well, the most immediate and disruptive technological catalyst on the horizon is, without a doubt, artificial intelligence.
Now, there's a massive debate here regarding how AI impacts this specific economic bubble, even among the tech billionaires themselves. The source contrasts Elon Musk's overarching view of AI with Sander Boon's own theory. Let's start with Musk's perspective.
Musk's theory is essentially one of radical, technologically driven utopian abundance. He suggests that AI, when fully coupled with advanced robotics, will become so hyper-productive and so efficient that the sheer volume of goods and services created will completely dwarf the expansion of the money supply.
So his argument is that even if the central banks keep the infinite credit card pressed to the floor, it simply won't matter.
That is the thesis. Musk theorizes that within a decade, money itself might become practically irrelevant because energy, manufacturing, and services will be so cheap and abundant.
We just outgrow the inflation.
In this scenario, inflation ceases to be a systemic problem because robotic production outpaces currency printing exponentially.
Okay, that is the optimistic Star Trek version of the future. But the source, Sander Boon, pushes back on that utopian vision incredibly hard. What is his counter theory?
Boon argues that Musk's perspective completely ignores the sociological reality of what AI is actually targeting. He points out a terrifying historical first. AI is not automating physical muscle like the tractor or the assembly line did. It is automating intelligence, administration, and language.
It's coming directly for the white-collar jobs.
And not just any white-collar jobs. Boon argues AI is aimed squarely at the massive, sprawling bureaucratic kingdoms that have been built up over the last 50 years to manage the makeable society.
The NGOs, the administrators.
The countless layers of middle management, the NGO administrators, the policy analysts, the compliance officers, the human resources departments, the very people whose livelihoods and societal status depend entirely on the soft money expansion of the administrative state.
So if AI achieves what it promises and wipes out that entire class of jobs,
Boon argues it will absolutely not lead to a smooth, peaceful transition into a post-scarcity utopia. It will cause massive, unprecedented societal friction and mass unemployment. You're threatening the core constituency of the thought bubble, a massive cultural class that is entirely accustomed to managing society without facing physical consequences and relying on the state for their position.
oh wow, and while that technological shock is looming over the labor market, there is also a massive geopolitical fracture occurring regarding the actual architecture of the money itself. The source brings up stablecoins.
This is a vital development in the plumbing of global finance. A stablecoin is a digital currency utilizing blockchain technology that is pegged to a reserve asset. Usually that asset is the US dollar, but they can potentially be backed by gold or even Bitcoin.
Right.
The source notes that the US and the UK are aggressively exploring and establishing favorable regulatory frameworks for these stablecoins.
Why would the US government want that? Don't they want people forced to use the traditional banking system that they control?
By embracing regulated stablecoins, the US is essentially pulling off a brilliant geopolitical maneuver. They're giving the global hegemony of the dollar a massive technological upgrade and a new lease on life.
Oh, so?
It digitizes the dollar, makes it frictionless, and allows anyone with a smartphone in Argentina, Nigeria, or Turkey to instantly access and hold digital dollars, thereby fiercely reinforcing its status as the world's reserve currency outside the traditional clunky banking rails.
But the source explicitly highlights that Europe is deeply afraid of this development. Why is Europe panicking over stablecoins while the US embraces them?
Europe finds itself trapped in a profound existential dilemma. According to the source, European leadership realizes they are facing astronomical funding needs in the coming decade. They have legally committed to incredibly ambitious, hugely expensive climate policies and the complete restructuring of their energy grid.
Which costs trillions.
Simultaneously, they realize they need a massive, historically unprecedented military buildup to counter the geopolitical threat from Russia.
So Europe needs to max out the infinite credit card more than they ever have before.
Exactly. But to successfully fund those massive initiatives without triggering hyperinflation, they absolutely need a closed, strictly controllable financial system.
They need to trap the capital.
They need to be able to issue mountains of new sovereign debt, legally force European banks and pension funds to buy that debt, and potentially inflate away the cost over time without allowing their citizens to escape the consequences.
And a smartphone app that offers instantaneous, frictionless stablecoins is the ultimate escape hatch.
It is the ultimate threat to their monetary sovereignty. If an average European citizen sees their euro rapidly losing purchasing power because of these massive state expenditures, and they suddenly have an app that lets them instantly legally convert their entire life savings into a digital dollar-backed or gold-backed stablecoin managed in New York or London,
They'll just move the money.
they will take their money and run.
It would be capital flight on a scale we've never seen.
Unstoppable capital flight. Europe is terrified of losing control over the stored wealth of its own citizens right at the exact historical moment it desperately needs to consume that wealth to fund its paradigm.
That is a terrifying bind to be in.
The source goes so far as to suggest that the European political fear of Russian aggression is subtly intertwined with opportunism. It provides a vital, unassailable moral justification to tighten capital controls over the domestic economy and prevent this wealth from leaking out to American stablecoins.
Okay, so bringing this all down to the ground, what does this all mean for you listening? How does this massive structural cycle actually end? If the system is this unstable, can we just, vote our way out of this? Can a bold politician just stand up at a debate, explain the math, and say, hey, everyone, the infinite credit card is maxed out. It was a mistake. We're going back to hard money tomorrow.
The source is remarkably cynical, but historically accurate on this point. No. You absolutely cannot simply vote to peacefully dismantle a 50-year-old macroeconomic paradigm.
Why is reform from within impossible?
Because the vested interests are simply too entrenched. Millions of high-paying jobs, the funding for entire academic disciplines, the profits of the banking sector, and the core functioning of the modern welfare state completely rely on a continuous expansion of soft money.
It's just too big.
As the source points out, echoing Upton Sinclair, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Such a great quote.
The vast army of people paid handsomely not to understand the fatal flaws of the system will fight tooth and nail, using every lever of institutional power to maintain the makeable society. They will not voluntarily surrender their blind spots.
So if a peaceful political reform from within the thought bubble is impossible, what is the actual mechanism for change?
History offers a very sobering reality, which the source leans into heavily. Paradigm shifts of this magnitude, the transition from soft money back to a hard reality, almost never happen peacefully or voluntarily. They require a systemic shock, a sudden, violent catalyst that forces the entrenched system to confront physical reality against its will. That could manifest as a massive, uncontrollable sovereign debt crisis that finally breaks the global bond market, where central banks simply lose control of interest rates.
Okay.
It could be a political revolution fueled by the boiling populist anger of a working class that feels the Cantillon effect has completely rigged the game against them. Or, tragically, as history often shows, the shock that resets the monetary system is a major geopolitical war.
The source brings up a very specific, chilling historical parallel to illustrate what this transition feels like: the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yes, they use the Soviet collapse to illustrate a vital point. When a massive, complex, entirely unsustainable paradigm finally collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, the transition phase for the average citizen is brutal.
How brutal.
When the Soviet system fell, living standards in the region dropped by an estimated 40% almost overnight. It was a catastrophic, generational period of adjustment.
40%. Wow.
The source isn't predicting exactly how the Western shock will manifest, whether it's inflationary fire or deflationary ice, but they argue that mathematically and historically, The longer institutions build the pressure inside the bubble and suppress cold thinking, the more violent and chaotic the eventual equalization will be.
That is honestly incredibly heavy. And if you are listening to this right now, you are probably pausing your workout or your commute thinking, okay, great. The foundations of modern society are made of unpayable debt and academic blind spots. The infrastructure is crumbling and a massive historical shock is inevitable. What on earth am I supposed to do with this information?
Yeah, it leaves you wondering.
Does the source offer any kind of playbook for the individual to navigate this?
They do offer a framework, pointing to what they call the Medici approach to wealth and survival.
The Medici, like the famously powerful Renaissance banking family in Florence.
Precisely the model. How did families like the Medici or other multi-generational wealth builders survive centuries of European wars, plagues, the debasement of currencies, and the total collapse of empires? The course argues they survived by adopting an incredibly long-term, highly conservative, fiercely independent view of reality.
They were the ultimate cold thinkers.
They survive through pure cold thinking. The playbook suggests you have to actively, consciously ignore the mainstream thought bubble.
Just tune it out.
You cannot blindly trust that major institutions, whether it's the central bank insisting inflation is transitory, the mainstream media managing the narrative, or academia promising a makeable utopia, have your best interests at heart, or even that they fundamentally understand the mathematical reality of the situation they are attempting to manage.
So what do?
You have to seek out and hold assets, skills, and structures that exist completely outside the immediate control and the inevitable devaluation of the soft money system.
You essentially have to become your own central bank, your own researcher. You have to rely on your own critical thinking to parse the noise from the signal.
Exactly. You must independently verify data, ruthlessly question the warm consensus of your peers, and mentally and financially prepare for the extreme volatility that historically arrives when a massive, decades-long imbalance finally corrects itself.
Let's try to pull all of this together, because we have covered a massive, sprawling amount of ground today. We started by looking at the deep plumbing of money itself, the transition from a hard money system that enforced strict discipline and virtue through the physical settlement of gold, to a soft money system, the infinite credit card, that allowed governments to build massive pyramids of debt without facing immediate physical consequences.
And then we examined how that fundamental monetary shift enabled a highly specific, extractive kind of globalization, one that hollowed out the industrial base of the West while massively enriching those closest to the fiat money printer, the Cantillon effect, operating on a global scale.
And we traced how that endless fountain of debt funding created a pervasive thought bubble inside our universities and legal institutions, a suffocating paradigm dominance where macroeconomists ignore the money supply, sociologists ignore human biology, and a managerial political class becomes obsessed with engineering a makeable society, completely detached from physical, financial, and thermodynamic limits.
Culminating in a widespread cultural loss of long-term vision, the physical decay of infrastructure, and a subsidized media landscape that prioritizes warm consensus over hard truth, ultimately leaving Western society deeply vulnerable to massive looming shocks from AI automation, stablecoin capital flight, and geopolitical fragmentation.
It is a sweeping, intensely critical, and deeply unsettling view of the current Western establishment. And as we said at the very beginning of this deep dive, our goal wasn't to tell you that Sander Boon has a crystal ball and is absolutely right about everything.
No, absolutely not.
But genuinely engaging with this perspective, really mapping it out, looking at the plumbing, and understanding these structural arguments is a vital exercise for anyone trying to navigate the modern world.
It is the ultimate practice in cold thinking. Even if you vigorously disagree with the source's cultural conclusions, actively challenging the consensus bubble and asking the difficult question, what if the mathematical foundation truly is flawed, is the only intellectual defense against being a lemming running joyfully off the cliff.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on the source material but pushes it one step further into the future.
Okay.
The source strongly suggests that a return to some form of hard money, something that strictly enforces discipline and cannot be politically manipulated, is mathematically inevitable. And they point to things like Bitcoin or algorithmic dollar-backed stablecoins as the potential future bedrock.
A cold technological solution to a deeply flawed human problem.
That's exactly the friction I'm thinking about. Consider this. For all of recorded human history, money has been deeply, intimately tied to a nation's sovereignty, its distinct culture, its human flaws, and the unique nature versus nurture of its people. The money was a physical reflection of the society that minted it.
Right.
If our next global hard money system is purely algorithmic, if it is entirely stateless, governed by immutable cold code, and completely devoid of any human politics, culture, or democratic intervention, will that actually pop our thought bubble? Or will it simply strip away the human element entirely, trapping us in a brand new, rigid, unforgiving, machine-made paradigm where humanity has no leverage or agency at all?
If the infinite credit card of the last 50 years was a disastrous human illusion, an infinite, unyielding algorithm might prove to be a very cold reality indeed.
Think about that. The next time you tap your phone to buy a coffee, you aren't just moving digital numbers on a screen. You are participating in and casting a vote for the very architecture of reality. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the bedrock, practice cold thinking, and we'll catch you next time.